Economic Survey 2017-18. The Economic Vision for Precocious, Cleavaged India. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. John Maynard Keynes. Since about 1980, India's growth performance has been robust, especially for a democracy. This has been backed up by policy reforms that have made India more open to flows of goods and capital and have reduced the size of the public sector, both in micro-efficiency and macro-fiscal terms. Yet, there are serious challenges that might impede further rapid progress, which emanate in part from the fact that India started out as a poor democracy with deep social fissure, a precocious, cleavage democracy. These long-standing challenges can be classified as an ambivalence about property rights and the private sector, deficiencies in state capacity, especially in delivering essential services, inefficient redistribution. Meeting these challenges is not just a matter of overcoming vested interests, it may also require broader societal shifts in ideas and narratives. India has replaced its erstwhile socialist vision with something resembling the Washington Consensus: open trade, open capital, and reliance on the private sector, essentially the same development model that has been tried and proven successful in most countries of Eastern Asia. Reforms along these lines have been adopted by every Indian government over the past quarter century. For example, in the last 2 years, the current government has institutionalized a commitment to low inflation in the new monetary policy framework agreement. The 4 standard measures: openness to trade, openness to foreign capital, the extent to which public sector enterprises dominate commercial activities, and the share of government expenditure in overall spending. Openness to trade. The standard measure of openness, the trade to GDP ratio. A fundamental truth of geography is that large countries tend to trade less than small countries. Being large makes the benefits of trading with the outside world very low relative to trading within the country. The opposite is true for small countries. Lacking an internal market, their benefits of trading with the world are relatively large, and hence they tend to have higher trade to GDP ratios. India's trade GDP ratio has been rising sharply, particularly over the decade to 2012, when it doubled to 55%. The recovery from the global financial crisis in 2008 was also swift. As a result, India's ratio now surpasses China, which is remarkable. India's foreign capital flows as a share of GDP reveals that despite significant capital controls, India's net inflows are, in fact, quite normal compared with other emerging economies. India's FDI has risen sharply over time. India's public sector undertakings, PSU, are exceptionally large. India is now squarely in the middle of the emerging market pack. This is partly because India has allowed the private sector entry into, amongst others, civil aviation, telecommunications, and financial services. These have all served to reduce the share of the public sector, even if there has not been much exit of the PSU enterprises themselves. Finally, consider the size of government. India is often accused of having a bloated government sector. But when the size of government expenditure for a group of countries is plotted against their per capita GDP, India sits on the regression line, indicating that it spends as much as can be expected given its level of development. In sum, the standard measures suggest that India is now a normal emerging market, pursuing the standard Asian development path. India has grown at about 4.5% per capita for 37 years, an impressive achievement. The road to be traversed. Three lingering features capture the doubt that it has not yet traversed the distance towards some vague and unspecificable endpoint that could be described as desirable or optimal. There has been a hesitancy to embrace the private sector and to unambiguously protect property rights, combined with continued reliance on the state to undertake activities that are more appropriately left to the private sector. State capacity has remained weak, as can be seen from poor delivery of essential services. Redistribution has been simultaneously extensive and inefficient. 1. Ambivalence about private sector and property rights. All states, all societies, have some ambivalence towards the private sector. After all, the basic objective of private enterprises maximizing profits does not always coincide with broader social concerns, such as the public's sense of fairness. But the ambivalence in India seems greater than elsewhere. The symptoms of this ambivalence towards the private sector manifest in multiple ways. The most well-known example is the difficulty of privatizing public enterprises, even for firms where economists have made strong arguments that they belong in the private sector. Consider the civil aviation sector. Defying history, there is still the commitment to make the perennially unprofitable public sector airline world-class. A similar spirit pervades the policy approach to the banking sector. Discussion of disinvesting the government's majority stake in the public sector banks is often difficult, in part because of the view that they are legitimate instruments for the state to allocate and redirect resources. Meanwhile, in the fertilizer sector, rife with distortions, public policy finds it easier to rehabilitate public sector plants than to facilitate the exit of egregiously inefficient ones. A similar legacy from the past circumscribes property rights. Initially, the right to property was inscribed as a fundamental right in the Constitution. But during the socialist era, the 44th Amendment removed Articles 19(1)(f) and Article 31 and replaced them with Article 300(a), thereby downgrading property to that of a legal right. The ramifications of this decision continue to be felt to this day, in such issues as retrospective taxation. Evidently, it seems politically difficult to uphold a widely shared, and judicially endorsed, principle against expropriation and retroactivity because of the fear of being seen as favoring the private sector, especially the foreign private sector. This is true in a number of recent cases, including Vodafone and Monsanto. 2. State capacity. A second distinctive feature of the Indian economic model is the weakness of state capacity, especially in delivering essential services such as health and education. Fukuyama, 2013, argues that the Indian state has low capacity, with high levels of corruption, clientelism, rules and red tape. The deepest puzzle here is that while competitive federalism has been a powerful agent of change in relation to attracting investment and talent, it has been less evident in relation to essential service delivery. At the level of the states, competitive populism is more in evidence than competitive service delivery. Policy making in certain areas has been heavily constrained, as a way of ensuring that decisions do not favor particular interests. The result is twofold. There is now adherence to strict rules, for example auctions of all public assets, that may not necessarily be optimal public policy. There is abundant caution in bureaucratic decision-making, which favors the status quo. In the case of the twin balance sheet problem mentioned above, it is well known that senior managers in public sector banks are reluctant to take decisions to write down loans for fear of being seen as favoring corporate interests and hence becoming the target of the referee institutions, the so-called 4Cs, courts, CVC, Central Vigilance Commission, CBI, Central Bureau of Investigation, and CAG. Controller and Auditor General. This encourages evergreening of loans, thereby postponing a resolution of the problem. See inefficient redistribution. Redistribution by the government is far from efficient in targeting the poor. Over the past 2 years, the government has made considerable progress towards reducing subsidies, especially related to petroleum products. Not only have subsidies been eliminated in 2 out of 4 products, there is effectively a carbon tax, which is amongst the highest in the world. Even the design of the Goods and Services Tax, GST, reveals the underlying tensions. On the GST, the political pressures from the states to keep rates low and simple, resulting in an efficient and effective GST, were minimal. Possible explanations. What explains these 3 distinctive features of the Indian development model? Central to understanding India's economic vision is the fact that it has followed a unique pathway to economic success, what might be called precocious, cleavaged India. Historically, economic success has followed one of the 2 pathways. Today's advanced economies achieved their current status over 2 centuries in which economic and political development progressed slowly but steadily. The second set of accelerated economic successes, mostly in East Asia, began authoritarian, explicitly or de facto, and gave way to political transformation only after a degree of economic success was achieved. Explicit authoritarianism came in 3 flavors: military, career, party, China, or individual dictatorship, Indonesia. India, on the other hand, has attempted economic development while also granting universal franchise from the very beginning. India was also a highly cleavage society than other countries, like language and scripts, religion, region, caste, gender and class. India is a clear outlier in the northwest corner of the plot, indicating both high levels of poverty and deep social fissures. A precocious, cleavage democracy that starts out poor will almost certainly distrust the private sector. The founders of India wanted to build the country by developing industry that would make India economically, as well as politically, independent. Conclusion. India has come a long way in terms of economic performance and reforms. But there is still a journey ahead to achieve both dynamism and social justice. One tentative conclusion is that completing this journey will require a further revolution in the underlying economic vision across the political spectrum.